Okay, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for joining us today for part one of our transformative three-part webinar series, From Data to Action, Shaping an Equitable Future, which is based on CCC's 2024 Keeping Track of New York City's Children data book. My name is Carlos Rosales, Director of Community Engagement at CCC, and I'll be hosting our webinar for today alongside my colleagues, Grimshaw and Juan. For over 30 years, this hallmark publication has provided detailed community-specific data to better understand the status and experiences of New York City's children, families, and communities, informing calls to actions to combat disparities and improve well-being. This 2024 edition draws inspiration from New York City's charter and its new preamble, born out of the work of the Racial Justice Commission and approved by New York City voters, with an eye towards building diverse, inclusive, and equitable city that measures up to our ideals as New Yorkers. To better understand this data, we built out this series to focus on different issue areas one at a time by doing a deep dive on issues impacting children and families, affirming our belief that transparent, accessible data can and should play a fundamental role in collective efforts to ensure every child is healthy, housed, educated, and safe. We have seen firsthand how data can influence decision-making and directly shape the trajectories of children's lives in New York City. And so, over the course of this series, we'll explore the most pressing topics facing our communities, including economic security, housing and homelessness, and early education and childcare. Our goal is to highlight the data that drives informed decision-making and actionable policies, ensuring that New York's children and families can thrive. In today's webinar, we'll dive into economic security with a focus on poverty reduction. We have two knowledgeable speakers from our CCC staff with us today who will provide analysis on these important issues. And following their presentation, we'll have time for audience Q&A to hear your questions and comments and thoughts about what we are sharing today. Now, welcome to join me, Juan and Rimshaw. Would you be able to introduce yourselves to our audience? And I'll let Juan go first.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Juan Diaz, and I'm a policy and advocacy associate for housing and income security at CCC.
And next, we have Rimshaw.
Morning, everyone. My name is Rimshaw Khan, and I'm a part of CCC's research and data team. I lead the production of several of CCC's data resources, including the data book, which was released earlier this year, our child and family well-being indices for the city and state. I also work with US Census data, mainly focusing on economic and housing security.
Thank you. Now, in a moment, Rimshaw will kick off with us the presentation that we have today. I'll just remind the audience that to submit questions that you have of our speakers, please use the Q&A function that we have for this webinar. And if anyone is experiencing any issues, we'll be able to message you on the chat and detail that. But without further ado, I'll pass it off to Rimshaw to start off our conversation today on economic security.
Great, thank you, Carlos. Just want to make sure you're seeing my screen as well, if you could confirm that.
Yes, we're good.
Okay, great. So welcome, everyone. I'll jump right into today's agenda. So first, I'm going to, since the focus of our data is building an equitable future, I'm going to talk about what we're referring to when discussing systemic inequalities, and then I'll move into talking about data and trends related to employment and income inequality, and then poverty trends focused on children and families with children. And then Juan will go over policy and advocacy solutions and actions. And of course, as Carlos mentioned earlier, we'll have time for questions at the end. So jumping right in, since we are going to be discussing inequities and racial disparities, the way in which we're looking at systematic inequalities today is through a model which some of you might be familiar with already, especially in the public health space, which is called the social determinants of health, which is referring to system level factors, whether it has to do with healthcare and education access and quality, whether it's economic stability and the neighborhoods in which people live, social and community contexts. These all come together to influence the outcomes in people's lives. So I want to be clear when I talk about inequities, whether they're racial inequalities or gender inequalities, that these do not stem from inherent differences in people. Rather, they are a result of systemic harm by policies and institutions. So the disparities that we'll discuss exist because marginalized groups in the US and our city have been blocked access to opportunity. So laying that as the groundwork, let's jump into talking about employment and income. So when we talk about economic security and the well-being of people and families, what often is discussed is the unemployment rate. So to recap, the unemployment rate is the percent of unemployed people in the labor force who are actively looking for work. And in the past decade, we can see from 2014 to 2019, the unemployment rate decreased in New York City, and it mimicked and was similar to national trends depicted by the gray line. However, of course, in 2020, the unemployment rate spiked during the height of the COVID-19 crisis, but in recent years has decreased pretty quickly down to a low of 5% last year. However, the question is, does this give us the entire economic picture? And as we'll see in a minute, there are many employment and income inequalities that are impacting families who are facing financial hardship. First, let's take a look at income inequality. So top earners have experienced more income growth than low-wage earners in the past decade. Adjusted for inflation, incomes in the 80th percentile, the top income group, have fared better than incomes in the 20th percentile, the bottom income group. And to recap, income percentiles show a person's income compared to others. For instance, if you're in the 80th percentile, that means those people are earning more than 80% of the population. So at the bottom level of income, the 20th percentile, workers continue to struggle with stagnant incomes. And this lack of growth and low wages plays a major role in financial stability. Looking deeper into income inequality, median incomes by race and ethnicity also tell an important story. Median income is a better measure than averages typically, since it's the middle point of an income distribution. So with averages, sometimes the number can be skewed by high earners. So as we can see, the group with the highest median income are white households with median incomes over 110,000. And Latina households have the lowest median income at just over 53,000. And I do want to note that there are definitely nuances within each group, definitely depending on the industry that people are working in, immigration, and so on. I know, as an example, as someone who's worked on data for the Asian American community, I know the Asian category covers a diverse range of people. So when it comes to subgroups, for instance, Asian Indians may have higher incomes than other groups like Burmese or Cambodian, who might have lower incomes. But overall, the general trend when broken down by major race groups follows this pattern. So gender inequality, job types, and access to full-time employment also play a significant role in income and earnings. Across all of the top job categories, men consistently earn more than women. The average gender pay gap is really notable in sectors like sales and administrative support. That's a 20% gender pay gap. And in the food industry and food services, which is a 23% gap. The jobs with the highest median incomes are in finance, business, management, STEM-related jobs in computer and engineering work. The lowest wages and incomes are in the food services sector. And these jobs and restaurants pay so little that even the median incomes in these jobs, because this chart is looking just at median incomes, even median incomes in these jobs place workers in poverty under the federal poverty level, which we'll talk more about what that is later. But in essence, these are people who are working yet still in poverty. And then to talk more about the gender gap, unequal pay for women is also influenced by lack of childcare, which leads women to reduce their time in the workforce or drop out of the workforce. And CCC had looked at previously done a previous analysis on census data that showed us that women living with children were 2.5 times more likely to cite childcare as the reason for being out of work. So this issue is definitely connected to childcare, which is a topic for our third webinar in this series. So definitely stay tuned for that. I believe it's December 13th. So we'll delve more into that on that day. So getting back to economic security, another measure that shows economic instability in households with children is an indicator called parental employment instability. And this is defined as a situation when neither parent or guardian in a household is working full-time. In New York City, 1/3 of children live in households with parental employment instability. And on the right, you'll see a map by community districts across New York, and that's showing the employment instability rate. And you'll see the dark blue highlights are the areas where there is the highest rates of instability. And these include neighborhoods in Upper Manhattan, Central Brooklyn, and across many parts of the Bronx that have high rates. The pattern of median incomes overall reflects income inequality and employment instability. So let's unpack that. For instance, to start off, median incomes increased in New York City for families with children from 53,900 to 77,600 in 2022, and these are rounded to the nearest 100. That's what that note means. And then, however, when you dig deeper, beyond the city statistic, you can see that there's a disparity in the neighborhood distribution of these median incomes. And these actually follow the opposite of the parental employment instability patterns, which we looked on at the other slide. The places that had the highest rates of instability also have the lowest incomes, lowest median incomes on this map. You'll see the lowest category, which is a light gray, 31 to 49,000 in median income. This is showing us that there is instability and lack of full-time work in the same area where median incomes are much lower. And areas that have high median income, unsurprisingly, are primarily what you think: Midtown, Lower Manhattan, Upper East Side, Upper West Side, downtown Brooklyn. And these areas have a high concentration of high income earners. And now I'll move into discussing poverty and how it's measured. So in this next table, we're looking at different definitions of poverty. So in the first row, you'll see the federal poverty level, also known as the official poverty measure. It is simply 3 times the cost of a minimally adequate food budget, and it's updated by the federal government every year, depending on the number of adults and children in the household. And then another measure that was created is the supplemental poverty measure. And this one includes more things than just food. It includes clothing, shelter, and utilities. And it is adjusted for location by states and metro areas. For instance, we'd be in the New York metro area. And lastly, these are three of many measures of poverty. I'll make that note. And in 2020, the city produced another measure that's specific to the city. That was based on 5 years of US consumer spending on those same items: food, shelter, clothing, and so on. How does this play out? The general standard for looking at minimum income or poverty level is to look at the income threshold, and that's the minimum amount needed for families. And as an example, using 2 adults and 2 children, we can see that in 2023, the federal poverty level for this household type was 30,000. And the poverty stats that you're going to see in the following charts and in the presentation are based on this federal poverty level, since this is used to determine eligibility for a lot of public assistance programs, including Medicaid and children's health insurance, for instance. Also in 2023, you can see the difference when it comes to the supplemental poverty level. That was 43,958. Now, remember from our earlier slide, that includes many more things than just food. It includes clothing, utilities, so it's slightly different. And then the New York City poverty level, that is from the report released in 2020, the last available one, that poverty level is 38,300. So that's pretty close. Now, delving into poverty. In a city of over 1.6 million children, New York's children have a poverty rate of 24.5%. So nearly a quarter of the city's children are living in poverty. In this chart, you see poverty over time for 3 different groups. In the light blue at the top are families with children, the dark blue is families without children, and the middle shows total families. So prior to the pandemic, poverty in New York City approached a 50-year low in 2019. But you can see that families with children were still the group with the highest amount of poverty at 18%, compared to 8% for families without children. And in recent years, there has not been much of a change. 1 in 5 families, 20%, have children that are living under the poverty threshold, and that pretty much remains unchanged for the past 2 or 3 years. The burden of poverty is not evenly distributed, though. So with children in single-parent households, especially those headed by single mothers, they're impacted by poverty rates the most. For instance, the highest poverty rates exist for Black single mothers is 30%. For Latina single mothers, the poverty rate is 39% for those households. So those are the highest rates. What's also interesting is that among 2-parent households, depicted by the gray, Asian and Hispanic or Latina households have the highest poverty rates. And this might be due to factors like higher rates of families with immigrants in those groups. So moving from poverty, there are measures that can be used to show the financial hardships that families are facing. An example of economic pressure and unaffordability are numbers related to SNAP, which is a supplemental nutritional assistance program that's meant to help households with lower incomes supplement their grocery budget. So in 2022, for the first time, enrollment in SNAP passed 1 million for households since the line that shows the gray since 2012. So that was the time when we were coming out of the Great Recession. There is some argument that SNAP utilization rates, which look at the share of people enrolled versus everybody who is eligible, basically the usage of SNAP, that can vary and change over time. But research demonstrates that looking at SNAP overall, it reduces food insecurity and can be used as an indicator of affordability and food security. Another indicator we can look at is cash assistance overall, and that's shown in these two charts. So cash assistance, this is financial help, which is provided through different programs to support families with children and people with low incomes. So in 2022, you'll see in the chart on the left, the line graph, almost 418,000 New Yorkers received cash assistance. And that is the total combined number for both children and adults. So I added those two categories. Now the bar graph on the right shows cash assistance by type. So there's two types, family assistance and safety net assistance. And in 2023, more than 70% of cash assistance recipients were receiving safety net assistance compared to family benefits. And that's because also the distinction for family assistance is that those benefits are time limited to just 60 months. And since most cash assistance recipients are adults, they're either single or with children, that indicates that people are moving from the category of family assistance to safety net assistance because they've maxed out their time in that category. And this is really important because it's showing us that people and families are increasingly having to rely on cash assistance and benefits for daily essentials. As you can see throughout the years, it's gotten to be the safety net assistance makes up a larger and larger share of recipients. And this is pointing towards long-term unaffordability and economic instability. And with that, I'll pass it to Juan to go over policy and advocacy.
Thank you, Rimsha. Again, I'm Juan Diaz, Policy and Advocate Associate at CCC. My portfolios are housing and economic security. So today I will talk about initiatives, policies that at CCC has been advocated for years, along with partners and policies that are in the next advocacies and we will be pushing for. As my colleague Rimsha Khan highlighted in her detailed data presentation, poverty, income insecurity disproportionately impacts Black and Latino families with children. There are several factors, including gender, immigration status, that create this income inequality through New York City and New York State. Poverty and income insecurity severely impact low-income families with children ability to cover housing, food, clothing, and other essential items. I saw this firsthand when I worked as a supervisor as a homeless prevention program in Brownsville, Brooklyn, several years. Having to see parents having to deal and make difficult choices in how to cover ongoing high cost of essential payments of rent, food, and clothing, right? Furthermore, during the COVID-19 pandemic and this slow economic recovery, it showed us that national and global emergencies can have a severe impact on low-income communities. It also brought to light how government involvement and lack of can move the needle on child poverty. From child tax credits that help lift over 3 million children out of poverty nationwide and reduce poverty in New York State by 40%, to eviction moratoriums, rental assistance, and extended unemployment benefits. If we can move into the next slide, please. CCC advocacy organization partners, individuals with lived experience have been calling on the New York State government to invest in policies to reduce child poverty. As Rimsha mentioned, one in 4 children in New York City experience poverty, 25%, and it's higher among Latino and Black children. In New York State, 1 in 4 children experience poverty. 1 in 4. Consider this: New York State's child poverty is higher than 31 other states nationwide. New York State's an economy that's much higher than several countries, nations around the world. So we were happy, therefore, pushing. We were, first of all, for years advocating for policies for that to move the needle on poverty. That's why we were happy to see in 2021, Governor Hochul recognized the need to address child poverty, and therefore she signed into law with collaboration with the Senate and Assembly. She signed into law the New York State Child Poverty Reduction Act, which aims to reduce child poverty in half, basically at 10%. It's a very ambitious goal. It requires reforms, it requires investments, and as such, as part of the Child Poverty Reduction Act, the Child Poverty Reduction Advisory Council was created, which is mostly commonly known as CPRAC. CPRAC members are appointed government officials, and individuals with lived experience, advocacy organization leaders, and they have been meeting for the last 3 years, conducting interviews, surveys, oversight hearings, and also working with research organizations to create data-driven policies to move the needle on child tax poverty. They have brought to the table several policies and reforms that can definitely decrease child poverty in New York State. As such, New CCC is supportive of several of them, and we're looking forward to continue advocating in the next advocacy season. There are specific reforms which could significantly reduce poverty, including enhancing the New York State child tax credit. For clarity, let me quickly explain the 2 tax credits that are most impactful for families with children. We have the state earned income child tax credit, which is basically a child tax credit for families and individuals who file taxes and have earned income. And the maximum cap to receive these benefits, it's around $60,000 for a family of 3. And there's a cap, and this refund is only for those who have earned income. And then we have the state child tax credit, which is called the Empire State Child Credit. As I mentioned earlier, child tax credit nationwide reduced poverty significantly. The child tax credit, the Empire State Child Tax Credit, is a refundable credit for families with children under 17, and is more flexible as far as income threshold. And it is much, much higher than the earned income tax credit. And low-income families have significantly increased their ability to have income in their pockets. So these are, if we can move into the next slide, please. Yes, thank you. So CPRAC has been has had meetings for several years, and there are several reforms that they're looking into bringing into the table and recommend for to include it in next year's budget. Some of these reforms, as I mentioned, are by strengthening their earned income child tax credit. Unfortunately, the state earned income tax credit does not include families that file taxes with an ITIN number. An ITIN number is an individual tax identification number that is provided for those who file taxes without a Social Security number. By enhancing the earned income tax credit and including these families, it will provide much needed assistance for hundreds of thousands of families throughout the state. Additionally, we are looking to support an expansion, a very significant expansion of the state child tax credit, the Empire State Child Tax Credit, to a significant amount, which is estimated that could reduce child poverty by over 20% in the next 10 years. Again, studies after studies have shown the impact that child tax credits can have on children. There's this constant criticism of child tax credit or additional resources for families, but research after research has shown that families spend money in the communities. It improves children's well-being, education. The earned income child tax credit promotes work, promotes the economy in local communities. So we're looking to continue advocating with state partners to promote child tax credit enhancements, expansions of the state child tax credit. Additionally, we also recognize the importance of families to increase their income and to move out of poverty. But additionally, we recognize that some families receive public assistance. Public assistance come in different forms. It comes as cash assistance. It comes as shelter allowance for those who need housing assistance. It comes in utility allowance. And cash assistance is available for families with very low income. It's basically families that receive TANF, temporary assistance for needy families. Unfortunately, the cash assistance for families has not been increased in over a decade. And the shelter allowance has not been increased in over 2 decades. And with the ever-growing cost of living in the city and the state, this is much needed. Let me give you some for perspective. Let me give you an example for a family of 3 and at a NYC unit. On average, at the state level, a family of 3 receives $347 in shelter allowance and a little over $200 in cash assistance. In some families who are mixed status is a family that has at least one family member has a valid social security number, and it's usually children. They receive far less. Imagine $347 in shelter allowance and a few $100s as cash assistance. For families who have children, this puts a big burden on their ability to just pay for necessities and move out of poverty. So we're looking to support this measure that are supported by statewide coalitions and people with lived experience. This is it's estimated to reduce child poverty, additionally, like the child tax credit, by 20% in the next 10 years. And again, this is something that I will cover in the following weeks in housing. But we all know how expensive, how costly housing is. Housing costs in New York City are. It is estimated that in New York City, over 30% of households pay more than half of their income goes into rent, right? And how insecurity, how expensive, the shelter system, it's a full capacity in New York City, and there's a lot of housing burden upstate as well. Oftentimes we have there's this notion that the city has a huge housing crisis, but upstate New York in places like Rochester, housing insecurity is also severe. So we, as advocates, we're advocating for a statewide housing voucher program that will be similar to Section 8, but it will be more inclusive. It would include, the aim is to include families who are like immigration status or mixed status, foster youth, to expand the population, because oftentimes populations are left out of housing assistance. This will help families who are insecure, at risk of eviction in the community, and also help relieve the population that are in shelter. If for some reason the housing budget does not work out, we're also calling into increasing housing stock or increasing funding for existing housing vouchers, increasing funding for rental assistance. The city and state level are also part of this assistance. Again, and as I mentioned, housing insecurity, income insecurity goes hand by hand. And we all know how expensive food is right now in New York State, in New York City. Therefore, we are also advocating, supporting measures that will enhance food security by increasing the amount for SNAP recipients, and also including groups, immigrant groups. There are bills, there are programs that have enhanced their eligibility, like in California, for instance. A group of immigrants are eligible now for SNAP benefits, and therefore, by increasing tax credits, cash assistance, housing, food, and other measures that will also promote income mobility, we'll be advocating in the next few months and throughout the year with other advocate organizations and lived experience experts. Before I conclude, CCC is part of the New York and Child Poverty Advocacy Group, is an anti-poverty statewide coalition, and we will be advocating on November 19th in Albany, and we hope that you will stay tuned, stay informed, because there will be more details about the advocacy date on November 19th in Albany. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Rimsha and Juan, for both the insight and the depth of need that we're seeing related to some of the indicators and trends around economic security that we are seeing, as well as some of the ways this is impacting the lives of families on the ground and what you're seeing with providers, partners, and in the ways we are trying to advocate and support families in these and many other different areas. I think what I'm going to do right now is let the audience know, since we are about to get into our Q&A segment, I want to ask those in the audience to please, if you have a question, enter that question in the chat right now, so that way we can begin asking both Rimsha and Juan questions that you have on your minds, or if you would like to ask the question live, you can raise your hand using the reactions or the raise your hand button in the Zoom navigation bar. So we do have some questions coming in, and I think we can go to the next slide as we cover the Q&A. But let me first see what we have in our chat. So I think one question that I am seeing is asked by Heidi, and I think this might go to Rimsha or Juan, is how much is the SNAP benefits for the average household receiving each month? Juan, I think you mentioned it might have been for another benefit or more generally public assistance that you're seeing some families receive. But I don't know if Rimsha or Juan, would either of you have that stat at hand on how much families are receiving or household is receiving each month for SNAP specifically?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that question. Yeah, so SNAP benefits varies depending on localities. With SNAP funding, SNAP is a federal program, right? But there are states like New York State that you can say that are generous, and New York City specifically also add more funding to these programs. So in the SNAP benefits in New York City are higher than upstate New York, for instance. And on average, a family of three, single parent and two children, receive approximately $400 a month in New York City. That might be less in upstate New York because, again, New York City allocates more funding the upstate localities. And there are several factors that impact the amount of SNAP benefits that families receive, whether they receive Social Security income or earned income. And usually SNAP, the income threshold is higher than cash assistance. So more families are able to receive this support. So again, a family of three on average receives approximately $400, but we all know very well that $400 in New York City for a family with children does not cover, perhaps it covers 2 weeks tops, and with very limited purchasing power. So that's why we are calling for an increase in SNAP, in the SNAP benefits amount, but also income supports and other programs to the state's enhancements of childcare, benefits for after-school programs for children to promote income mobility. Thank you.
I'll
Great, thank you,
also
Juan.
add to that, in terms of, while we don't track the average amount, so thank you, Juan, for that insight, because that hit the nail on the head in terms of answering the question. On our data site, I will plug our data site. We have our SNAP indicator, which is updated and shows SNAP enrollment numbers for 2022, 2023. If we could share a link to that in the chat. So if you want to delve into and look at enrollment rates across neighborhoods, it's a great resource on our site.
So our next question that I have on the chat, and I also see questions coming in our Q&A. So bear with me as I get through them. Nancy is asking, what is the estimated cost of increasing the Empire State child credit to $1,500? And I don't know, Nancy, I think you are asking the statewide cost, or is it something different? But I don't know, Juan, if you're able to answer that question, just like the overall cost or
Sure.
what the.
Sure, Nancy, thank you for that question. And when I mentioned reforms, I mentioned investments. Yes, most of the investments to move the needle on child poverty have a cost, right? But that's why we call them investments in advocacy, because there's a return on investment, right? The poverty reduction, the ability of families to move out of poverty and dependency, the ability of children, fulfilling their education, goals. Let me give you an example for enhancing the child tax credit for, let's say, approximately, $1,500. It is estimated by the Urban Institute that it would have a cost of over $3 billion over the next 10 years, over the next decade. It's about $300 million a year. But again, it's an investment, it's a commitment that the government's office asked for the study, the research, because it is an investment. And it will have it's a significant investment, but it's a significant when you talk about 20% child poverty reduction over the 10 years. As advocates, we know it's worth it.
Thank you, Juan. And I do just want to acknowledge a comment that was put in the chat by another person, Alyssa, who related to the earlier SNAP question that she just wanted to add. And I think you know this, and for our audience too, that with SNAP, the minimum benefits can be as little as $23 a month for recipients. And I think, as we all know, going to the supermarket or the grocery stores nowadays, $23, I mean, there are families that can stretch a dollar because sometimes we have to, but $23 nowadays does not really get us much in the way of some of the essential household goods we get at the store, groceries, whether it's food or other household necessities. So thank you, Alyssa, for that comment and reminding us about some of the realities of these benefits programs for individuals or families. Next, I see there's a few more questions in the Q&A. I think our next one is from Mary Jane, who is asking, what are your thoughts on converting the EITC from a one-year check to a deduction, increasing parents' regular paychecks instead?
Yes, thank you for that question. It has been discussed broadly. There's always debates over, how to improve child tax credits, the earned income. But again, it's quite, as it is, it's quite difficult to calculate, to mail checks, to mail payments. Yes, there are initiatives, there's talk, but there's really, we have been focused on enhancing it now. And once it's enhanced, perhaps we can talk about other methods to make it easier, to make it more accessible. But it definitely, I would always say in policy is incremental. And I must recognize that there's been some advances in recent years. For instance, with the child tax credit, 2 years ago, believe it or not, children under 4 were not included in the state child tax credit. Children under 4, when babies are in most need at that age, they were not included. So we're happy to see through advocacy that 2 years ago, the child tax credit was expanded to include children under 4. And this year alone, there was a one-time payment for families. Pretty sure you work in social service, some families receive a one-time payment, a little over $300 in the summer. So there are steps, and yes, increasing the number, increasing the enrollment, modifying the payments are also part of initiatives, but it's one step at a time. And it's very complex. Tax policy is very complex as it is. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Juan. And I think we're going to stick to you before I go to Rimshot for the next question. The Reverend Dr. Calvin Kendrick is asking, how should we approach our local political leaders about these facts? Like, what are some of the questions others should be asking? And maybe we could refer to like some of the questions that we ask in our advocacy. But overall, like if anyone wants to talk to their local elected leader, where's the starting point? What are the critical questions or the critical things we should be sharing with them?
Excellent question. Thank you. Yes, absolutely. First, number one is to know who are our elected officials at this local level, at state level, know their number, their address. And this is a great example of the CCC's data book because it's broke down into neighborhoods. So if you look at your neighborhood and let's say you live in an area where it's at the highest of lack of childcare, poverty, housing insecurity, you can call on that number, right? Say a CCC report, highlighted that in this neighborhood there's insecurity on housing, there's high levels of poverty, right? And always acknowledging the elected officials' work because knowing their policies and asking them and letting them know, thank you for supporting X bill, right? However, we noticed that there's still issues in this. We are looking forward to work with you to advance this policy. What can we do, right? And staying informed is also a good idea. But using at least 1-2 points of data, it helps you a lot to bring the attention to elected officials.
All right, thank you, Juan. Hopefully that provides some guidance and instruction. And of course, as always, if anyone would like to connect with us further on ways we can engage our elected leaders more, you are more than welcome to connect with us and connect with Juan and the rest of our policy and advocacy team. In the chat, I'll just reference Julie just placed a link to our Keeping Track of New York City Children data book that was released earlier this year. So if you haven't had the time to access the data book and look over the economic security chapter or other chapters in there, the link is available to you. And we have that broken up into its different sections and themes. I just want to acknowledge that there is a question in the chat from Gina Park. A question related to the number of daycare subsidies versus the number of available daycare seats. Gina, if you can just put your contact information in the chat, we can follow up with you to get that answer to you and connect you to our research and data team who can provide you the information on that or where you can find it. I would also suggest we do have another webinar series that focuses on related topics to this later in the year. So we'll be sure to send you the information to join that webinar where you get more insight into early care and education. I do want to see, I'm not seeing any other questions. And so I just want to give it a moment to our audience to see if there is anyone else with another question. Please put it in the chat or put it in the Q&A. I'll give everyone a moment to do so, but in the meantime, I do have some general questions I made up during this time for Rimshot and Juan while we wait to see if there's anyone else that has questions. So Rimshot, for you, I wanted to ask, there's a lot of data points and metrics you shared during your presentation, and I want to kind of ask you a personal question on what you feel or what you see as an indicator that stands out to you, either because of an issue that you really care about or that you've been working on for some time now. And I welcome if it's a trend that is concerning or something that's moving in a positive direction. I'll leave it up to you to decide. But what kind of stands out to you, and what's a data point that you want to showcase and make sure that the audience member, our audience, leaves with?
I think the most compelling statistic is also unfortunately the most concerning, which is the overall child poverty rate and the trend in child poverty being really persistent. So the child poverty rate is 24.5% for last year, and for 2022 and 2023, according to like the latest census estimates that were released. And that's really concerning because that shows a quarter of New York City children were in poverty for more than 2 years, essentially. And that shows that the situation is not improving. So that really concerns me. I feel like that's something of note, and hopefully policy actions can influence that. We know temporarily the child poverty rate did decrease dramatically during the COVID-19 crisis, when there was the American Rescue Plan that was put into effect, and there was the expanded childcare tax credit and many other policy actions. So that basically halved or greatly decreased the child poverty rate. But that was only temporary, and now we see that we're back to a quarter of children in the city living in poverty, and that is not a good statistic, and we should reduce that as much as possible and bring it down to zero, in my opinion.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your personal thoughts on that and that important data point for us. And I'll echo, like, we did see some of the impact like the child tax credit had during the pandemic, and ways that impacted families. And of course, is an area that we're continuing to fight now to make sure that becomes a permanent fixture in New York, at least. Juan, I'm going to also ask you a question because I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat or from the audience. So this might be the last one for us. Your question is, I think like it really connected for me when you were sharing some of the personal experiences that you were hearing from families and through the work that you provided. So I kind of want to continue on that line. Is there something you are hearing either from partners, providers, or families, or from your own experience related to our theme today of economic security that you want to highlight for people, and or just double down as like, this is what our providers, these are what our families are saying about how the economy or how issues around economic security are really just impacting them on a day-to-day basis. Is there anything that stands out to you that you want to share with the audience?
Sure, thank you, Carlos. Absolutely, from my own personal experience working, face to face with families in need, partners. We are part of the Family Homeless Coalition, coalition of services providers, shelter providers, advocacy organizations. When we have meetings, they share how families are struggling to make ends meet, are struggling to having to make difficult choices with food, right? How it's just not, benefits are not sufficient, how rent continues to, even if it's on a rent stabilized apartment, it continues to the rent to increase, but yet there's job insecurity in some sectors. There's the minimum wage was recently increased, but it's not keeping up with the economy. Public benefits are not keeping up. Family have less money in their pockets, and as Rimsha mentioned, poverty continues to remain the same, but it's concerning because the cost of living continues to increase. So it's very concerning because in the next year or two, the costs are going to continue to increase. Yet the services, for instance, in the city, there's high number of vacancies at city agencies, right? Public benefits delivery payments, recertifications are delayed, and I'm very sure many of the audience that if they work in social services, they see that the same. We have families are having to struggle to make ends meet, to get to the end of the month for the next pay, and living paycheck to paycheck.
Thank you, Juan. And so I'm not seeing any other questions for the audience. So I think we'll be closing our webinar for today. And I want to thank both Rimsha and Juan for their presentation, and everyone in the audience for your questions and being here with us to learn more about this critical issue area for families, as we know that the coming few weeks and months are a critical time and will shape a lot of decisions that get made and ways in which we approach our advocacy in the future. I do want to say, like, just to reference for some questions that were also in the chat, that we will share information about the November 19th Advocacy Day with our audience. And so there's going to be a follow-up email in about a week's time from today, following up with materials from this webinar, as well as steps to get involved in advocacy. And of course, please remember that if you registered for today's webinar, we'll automatically add you to the RSVP list for part 2 and part 3 of this series. Part 2 is going to be focusing on housing and homelessness, which will be on November 15th, a Friday at the same time. And then part 3 will focus on early education and childcare on December 13th, again on a Friday at the same time. So thank you for joining us here as we cover economic security issues impacting children, families, and communities in New York City. Thank you again to Rimsha and Juan for the incredible insights you shared here today and how we can act. And we look forward to seeing you all in the coming weeks as we continue to ramp up our advocacy and share this critical resource and information with you. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon and your weekend. Bye-bye.